Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of comparative literature in Germany, and this is my series on literary theory. Today we will delve into the beginnings of literary hermeneutics, the art and study of understanding and interpretation in antiquity. If you're as excited about the topic as I am, let us just jump straight into the video. But before, I want to tell you the two main sources that I've been using for this video. The first one is Peter Sondi's Introduction to Literary Hermeneutics, which starts in Antiquity. The second one is a book that gives a big overview of the history of hermeneutics from ancient times to the present. It is called Hermeneutik, die Geschichte der abendländischen Textauslegung von der Antike bis zur Gegenwart, and was published by Meinrad Böll, Wolfgang Reinhardt and Peter Walter. I've been taking many notes and I will present everything I found most fascinating about the emergence of literary hermeneutics in antiquity in this video to you now. I hope you enjoy it. Literary hermeneutics emerged in ancient Greece in the classical period between 500 and 330 BCE. A time when in Athens people tried to read the ancient epics of Homer, such as the Odyssey and the Iliad, and realized they couldn't really grasp the language as well as they wanted anymore because it was so foreign to them. Think of yourself trying to read a medieval text in your language, thinking that you're English speaking and you want to read medieval English. You're French, you want to read medieval French, or German and you want to read, for example, the Nibelungenlied. This could be comparable to the way that people had difficulty reading or understanding the texts of Homer in ancient times. So a concept was needed to grasp the language, to make sense of the words, to understand the text. So what did people do? Interpreters of the texts of Homer and others came up with two different kinds of methods. One of them was trying to seek the literal sense of the words and sentences, the sensus litteralis. The other one was aiming at an allegorical sense, the sensus allegoricus. Let us start with looking at the sensus But let us start by looking at the literal sense, or sensus litteralis. The approach aimed to uncover the original meaning of words and phrases, so the meaning that it would have had in the times of Homer, for example, because the interpreters acted here as mediators and tried to replace the outdated or obscure language of the original text with modern equivalents to make the text more comprehensible to readers in the contemporary times. So the goal was to preserve the integrity of the text while bridging this historical and linguistic gap. But the intention was really not only to overcome this historical distance between the original text and the language that the contemporary people spoke, but also to bring the text out of its historical remoteness into the present, to make it not only understandable but also present. So to show it to be an undiminished, valid and canonical text in the end. So to really show people that it is still valid, still relevant, still interesting and also still understandable. Peter Sondi has given a very good quote for this that I want to read to you now in English, in my translation. It is called, "The hermeneut is an interpreter, a mediator who uses his knowledge of language to make the incomprehensible, the no longer understandable, understandable. He does this by replacing the word that is no longer understood with another that belongs to the language level of his reader." So that's basically also a summary of what I've been telling you. The original words were replaced by words that were familiar to the people reading the text. so it was easier to understand. Then you also have this allegorical sense, the sensus allegoricus. It derived from the dissatisfaction with Homer's and Hesiod's portrayal of the gods. It led thinkers such as Xenophon and the Stoics, among others, to reinterpret these figures as personifications of moral or cosmic principles. Allegory became a tool for adapting texts to align with philosophical or ethical ideals. So this allegorical sense was basically put into the works to find a more moral or ethical reading by reinterpreting the text. And it served a very different purpose than the literal reading, which tried to aim at maintaining the original sense in a way, the original meaning. And here, in the allegorical sense, another meaning was put into the text that suited the goals of the readers and the interpreters, and that what they thought the text should teach, for example, in form of a moral or ethical lesson. So this was carried on throughout antiquity, and this reinterpretation of texts in this allegorical sense did not only happen with the writings of Homer, Hesiod and others, but it was also taken up in Christianity by Christian writers who adopted this idea and, for example, reimagined and reinterpreted the Old Testament in their writings in the New Testament. So, for example, the Song of Solomon was often reimagined as a representation of divine love or the love for Israel, and this method allowed interpreters to address theological concerns. Another example would be the reading of the figures of Abraham and Isaac from the beginning of the Old Testament, whose story was understood as a foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice in the New Testament. These are just two examples, and there's way more that I don't want to get into detail too much because I'm more concerned with the literary works in this video. But I want to summarize this here now to see what this allegorical and the literal sense meant and why they were important and what their purpose was. So both interpretations tried to overcome this historical distance between the original language and the times of the interpreters, but the methods they used were quite different. So while the grammatical or the literal interpretation sought to find the original meaning and tried to conserve it by replacing its historically alienated linguistic expression with a new one, the allegorical interpretation attempted to give the alienated expression a new meaning that originated not in the imagination of the text but in that of the interpreter. As the allegorical interpretation relies on the idea of multiple senses, it didn't have to question the literal interpretation, which was quite useful because this way both interpretations and both kinds of senses could coexist at the same time and did not clash with each other. So this was a short overview of the two senses that emerged in ancient Greek. But let us now turn to the Roman antiquity and see what we can learn from this time. Roman hermeneutics inherited and expanded upon Greek traditions. As interpretation became more structured and integrated systematic procedures within education and philosophy. Among grammar and rhetorics lessons, a four-step approach was commonly employed for interpreting and reading. The first step was the reading part, in Latin called lectio, in ancient Greek called anagosis. Texts were often written in a so-called scriptio continua, which lacked spaces or punctuation, so The task of the reader was actually to just reconstruct the meaning by identifying word divisions and sentence structures. So really the reading itself was a kind of task of interpretation, because the texts, the words were not given the way that they were meant, but they had to be reconstructed. The second step would be the explanation, enunciatio or exegesis. The stage involved both grammatical and literary interpretation. First, there would be the grammatical analysis, focused on linguistic elements such as the grammar, the etymology of the words, and the meter. And then there would also be the literary analysis, which examined the broader context, including the mythology, geography, and historical references. So basically, there was the literal interpretation of the text itself, and then the context that was taken into the understanding, so to broaden the understanding. The third step would have been the textual criticism, also called emendatio or diatorsis. Textual variants were compared between teachers and pupils to determine the most accurate version of a text. This is also still common in editions of text in classical philology. The fourth step is the assessment of the text, indicium or crisis poematon, which evaluated the text's moral and ethical content instead of aiming at the aesthetic appreciation of the text. So as you can see, as we've seen already with the allegorical sense in the ancient Greek antiquity, the moral and ethical content of the work was oftentimes emphasized. But the aesthetic perspective was also emphasized, but more adopted by the rhetoricians, as they analyzed the structure of the texts in the so-called economia, the appropriateness in the decorum, and the appropriateness or decorum of the language and the storyline with regard to the events and characters described. In addition, they also analyzed the diction, the conciseness, and the practical relevance of the ideas presented, as well as the comprehensiveness or brevity of expression. All of these were important criteria whereby the appropriateness of the language and style to the respective genre or the expression to the circumstances was often the most important criterion. So you see that they already had very clear ideas about what made a text good, what kinds of elements it needed to include to be understood and to carry its message and to be effective in the end. And generally, more weight was oftentimes put on the interpretation than on the criticism in all of these steps. But Roman rhetoricians also stressed the importance of the authorial intent behind the works and the integration of the textual components into a cohesive whole. They applied key principles in interpretation, which are called the principle of charity and the principle of economia and decorum. The first one, the principle of charity, involved categorizing legal cases into general issues by generalizing specific circumstances. Disputes were divided into factual concerns, genus rationale, and interpretative issues of normative texts, genus legale. The latter addressed discrepancies between wording and meaning, scriptum versus sententia, or authorial intent, voluntas, advocating for adjustment to align with equity by interpreting statements as either vague or specific as needed. So this principle was basically focused on understanding what the text was really aiming at and what was the case in the text. So it's mainly a legal concept that was applied for legal cases and was very important to see what was actually the point here, what was happening and what was important. The second principle was the economia, which emphasized the organizing the material harmoniously for a maximum impact, while creating speeches required considering the whole in composing parts, interpreting texts required understanding passages within the entire context. So here in general you have the idea of a hermeneutic circle, as you only understand the whole through its parts, but you have to also structure something in parts to gain the whole and to make sense as a whole. And that goes for both the creation or the writing of a text as well as for the interpretation. So this often goes closely hand in hand. And this is also why understanding and creating were closely tied, and also grammatic, rhetoric and stylistic studies were often intertwined and taught together. The third principle was the decorum, which involved aligning speech style with the situation, the audience and the material. So this included the linguistic correctness, the clarity, ornamental language and appropriateness. And the interpretation mirrored speech composition by considering historical and contextual questions. The who, what, where, why, how and when that we still know from basic understanding and interpretation of texts to see what is actually the case in the text. These are some of the most important principles, but now we also want to look at Poetics, which explored the purpose, the nature and the assessment of poetry or literature in general, and which is still very relevant today, but formed some general principles that were already very relevant in antiquity. We will start with Plato, who did not comment on poetics in a systematic treatise, but in various contexts and scattered throughout his work. The recurring themes of his writing include, in particular, the poetic enthusiasm for God, or enthusiasmos, and the imitative nature of poetry, also known as mimesis. Both were long considered to be contradictory and full of tension within themselves and among each other. And Plato was also seen as a more or less determined opponent of poetry well into the 20th century. But by now, in contrast, research has recently painted a more consistent and poetry-friendly picture of Plato. According to this new view, the traditional assumption is correct that Plato did not view poetry as an autonomous entity in the absence of a corresponding concept of fictionality, but rather measured it against the same standard of objective truth and knowledge as philosophical texts. But this no longer means a fundamental rejection of poetry, but rather a no to certain forms of poetry and parts of the poetic tradition. So, in contrast to the tradition that preceded him, Plato sees the hallmark of poetry not in the meter, but in its depictive character, its mimesis. Generally speaking, good poetry uses language to create completely or partially invented images, as images of ideal, centrally imperceptible models make these perceptible due to the similarity required between model and image. In concrete terms, it depicts the actions of human and divine characters and thus allows the various mental faculties of the characters, their virtues and vices to be recognized. This goal, this depiction, is achieved by combining the individual actions into a story, the mythos, in such a way that the overall action appears as a necessary consequence of the characters and their actions and goals. So that conversely, the actions can be used to infer the characteristics of the characters. So it's basically aiming at a quite natural depiction or showing the nature of people and their actions. For Plato, good poetry, which means poetry that is educationally valuable for the individual as well as for the state, chooses the same subject as thinking, the internally true ideas of the intelligible world. Good poetry does not depict the world as it is, but in its ideality, This is, good actions always stem from good characters and always lead to happiness and success, while bad characters commit bad deeds and suffer harm. The cognitive attitude behind this mimesis is that of thinking. Its foundations, in the best case, is conscious episteme. The best poet and critic is therefore the philosopher. For the future that Plato saw, he called for the purification of the traditional literature and the creation of a new philosophical poetry, a purified, purposeful poetry that strengthens the mind. As because of its pedagogical effect, it should above all show good character and the usefulness of good actions. The preferred genre for this is narrative poetry in the eyes of Plato, in which the poet speaks as himself and not imitates a character, especially the praise of gods and rulers. Hymns and encomia. Poetry from the other two genres, imitative, tragedy and comedy, and mixed, partly imitative, partly narrative poetry, epic, are only suitable to a limited extent. Tragedy is not at all eligible because it cannot do without flawed characters, but the portrayal of completely or partially bad characters sets a bad example for the audience and has a negative effect on the mental state of both the actors and the audience. Comedy under certain circumstances, because although it shows bad characters, these can serve as a contrast and even ridiculed for the good to be strived for. Epic when it portrays predominantly good characters. However, poetry is not fundamentally rejected by Plato. This is the overview of Plato, and now we will go over to Aristotle. So in his Poetics, Aristotle understands poetry as an imitation of human actions, mimesis praxios, in the medium of language, or more precisely, the actions of certain characters in which their basic attitudes are reflected, and thus the different manifestations that the general abilities, the dynames, available to all people can assume in a certain character are shown. Poetry does not reflect general character attitudes or ideal type characters such as the good king or similar, nor does it describe them in generalizing statements like science. Instead, in the depiction of concrete actions, it reveals the respective conditions that make them possible. For example, the character as a different manifestation of general human abilities, each with its own preferences and dislikes. The poetic interest in knowledge is thus a philosophical one because it is theoretical, but a concrete one, not an abstract one, because it is related to the understanding of individual actions, not to the reason for actions in general. The actions depicted do not have to be probable or necessary in their external references to reality, for example, that someone who is hit in the heart dies, but in their internal references to the acting character, that a brave man is brave, for example. In newer research, Aristotle's statement, where he compares poetry to historiography, and in which he says that poetry represents something more general and is therefore more philosophical than historiography, is no longer understood in an idealizing sense now. Rather, it is meant that poetry does not, like historiography, indiscriminately represents all human actions, including those in which, as is usually the case in reality, external influences such as chance play a role, but only those exemplary ones in which the general nature of a character trait or talent, is expressed particularly purely. Aristotle calls a coherent, unified overall plot, composed of such exemplary individual actions and directed towards a specific goal, a myth. This is the central design principle that makes poetry into poetry, in contrast to, for example, the often disparate history. According to this reading, Aristotle adopted the concept of mimesis from Plato, who was his teacher. So His Poetics is generally no longer read primarily as a poetic apologetic counter-proposal to Plato, but rather the commonalities between the two are now emphasized. These include in particular the classification of literary genres according to their narrative mode, such as report, direct speech, or a mixture of both, the determination of the poetic means, bound and unbound, language, rhythm and melody, and their subordination to the central content criteria of myth and mimesis. The influence of rhetoric, which is evident in Aristotle's repeated cross-references to his rhetoric, but which is of only secondary importance within his conception of poetry, which is primarily determined by the content, came to the fore in the Hellenistic Roman period. Poetry was now considered, as it had been by the sophists already, to be primarily determined by linguistic form, and content-related guidelines disappeared. The content was also only seen in the teaching it contained, while the specificity of poetry was seen in the unprosaic form, which also brought joy and emotional movement to the audience. So while the teaching was tied to reality because it had to be true, the inventive character or the fictionality of poetry was now an essential part of the linguistic form, whereby the invented material should be as realistic as possible and thus credible. Poetry was thus the reproduction of reality in an aesthetically pleasing form, which is why the poet needed inventive and creative genius as well as artistry. This is what you can keep in mind, I think, especially the last sentence I've been saying. So keep in mind, poetry was seen from Aristotle as the reproduction of reality in an aesthetically pleasing form, which is the reason why a poet needs both inventive and creative genius as well as artistry. So he has to know what he's writing about, and he has to have ideas, and he has to be creative and put it into a new form. Horace's Ars Poetica became the second basic text of Western poetics after Aristotle's Poetics. In Horace's work, poetry appears primarily as the product of rhetorical artistry. But for Horace, true poetry is not just about following rules, but also requires innovation and specialty. And so the dialectic of tradition and innovation, of rule-based convention and ingenious inspiration. This forms the basic motive of the Ars Poetica. Horace was basically concerned with a form of poetry in which a poem represented itself as a harmonious whole, the flawlessly realized order of the appropriate. And Horace emphasized a great effort to achieve balance and harmony in writing. This is a very important consideration, the Ars Poetica. The greatest importance is attached to the unity and wholeness of the work of poetry, that is unum totum simplex. For this, its inner coherence is required above everything else. The concept of mimesis is being redefined by Horace in that imitatio in the Ars Poetica refers on the one hand to the imitation of reality, and on the other hand, as in rhetoric, to the imitation of literary models. As far as the poet is concerned, he needs both talent, ingenium, and knowledge of rules, as Aristotle put it before him, but the most important thing is knowledge of people and life. When writing poetry, the principle of formal rigor must also be observed, which requires constant refinement of the text in accordance with the Greek models. So with regard to the aesthetic quality of the work of poetry, Horace says that poetry should be like a painting, ut pictura poiesis. And finally, as far as the effect of poetry is concerned, it is ideally a twofold one: instruction and entertainment. But let us now finally turn to Pseudo Longinus. In the Baroque and Enlightenment periods, another ancient, previously barely received ancient work received greater attention. The classicist treatise On the Sublime, Perihypsos, by an anonymous author, now known as Pseudolonginus. The sublime, hypsos, is presented as the characteristic feature of great literature, and the text set itself the task of examining the factors necessary to create it. It is described as the extraordinary powerful element through which great literature captivates the public. The aim is to amaze and shock the audience into ecstasy, not to convince them, as is the aim of the credible and pleasing. And in late antiquity, I will quickly give a short overview from the book. I've been reading how the hermeneutics transitioned into the Middle Ages. The late antiquity basically marked the transition from pagan to Christian dominance in writing and interpretation. Figures like Servius applied traditional allegorical methods to classical texts, interpreting them with a Christian framework. And Augustine's Doctrina Christiana formalized this approach by asserting that pagan texts held value only insofar as they aligned with biblical truth. Any element that contradicted scripture were dismissed as invalid. Christian educators adapted classical methods to align with theological goals. For instance, Cassiodor and Isidore of Sevilla integrated grammar and rhetoric into a Christianized curriculum, ensuring the preservation of ancient interpretative techniques while subordinating them to biblical authority. This adaptation extended to the reinterpretation of classical works, which were reframed to support Christian teachings as well. And the integration of classical and Christian traditions ensured the survival and transformation of hermeneutics, as by aligning ancient interpretative methods with the theological priorities of the medieval period, scholars preserved the intellectual legacy of antiquity while laying the groundwork for future developments in textual analysis. So here we are coming to a close for this video on the beginnings of literary hermeneutics in antiquity. I hope you learned something you could follow and you enjoyed the video. Two of the things that I found most fascinating when learning about this topic was for once how these senses, the sensus litteralis and the sensus allegoricus, emerged in the period of classical Greece in between 500 and 330 BCE, and how these interpretations of Homer were so challenging, because these days we still try to grasp and understand the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, and we still have our difficulties with that, and people in antiquity had their own ideas about the interpretation and they came up with their own solutions. And seeing how these senses served so many different purposes was quite interesting to me. So one sense to retain this almost original meaning, but also showing how text could still be canonical a few hundred years later. And then this allegorical sense that was also used to transform the meaning of the text into something that suited the readership more, for example, moral or ethical lessons that you could see within those stories that maybe weren't in them, but that were read into them in a way. And the other thing that I found really interesting to see was throughout the development of hermeneutics, how it was so closely connected with the grammatical lessons, the rhetorical lessons, the style lessons, and how, for example, Aristotle in the Poetics and Horace in the Ars Poetica, which became two of the most important works of Poetics until today, how they saw such a close connection between the creation of a literary work and the reception of it. And I think this is something we somehow tend to forget by now, or we don't pay as much close attention to as we could, because by seeing how these rules for writing would be applied in practice and how they could be used for the interpretation as well, to see whether some author actually applied these rules into their writing or not, and how they made use of the ideas and the values that were relevant among society is so interesting to see. And I think that the way hermeneutics was becoming so lively in that time already, and how it was passed on throughout history, is a very interesting topic to me. So the next video in this mini series on the development in hermeneutics will look at hermeneutics in the Middle Ages and from then onwards. And I hope you will stay tuned for that, because it's also quite interesting to see. But I can also make a video about legal hermeneutics, theological hermeneutics, or philosophical hermeneutics, and the beginnings of that. If that's something you're interested in, please let me know or comment down below. Otherwise, I think I would more focus on the literary hermeneutics, because I myself am more concerned with literary works and their understanding and interpretation. I thank you for your time, if you listened until here and stayed so long with me to uncover this topic a bit more. And if you haven't yet, I would ask you to consider subscribing to the channel, because this helps the channel grow and makes me quite happy. I am immensely thankful to share my research and my passions on this channel with you, and to take you along on my journey on learning more about literary hermeneutics and what it has to offer us. And I will really hope to see you in my next videos. And other than that, I hope you have a nice day or evening whenever you're watching this video. And thank you for watching, and see you in my next one. Bye bye.